Okay, I'd like to talk to you about this since we talked a little bit about it, the mental health. It's kind of a joke among us spiritual people, how exactly how many diagnoses they've tried to come up with to fix our, we've all been diagnosed with depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, schizoaffective,
Yeah.
PTSD, ADHD, rather than just the simple thing. We're spiritual. There's nothing really wrong with us.
Mhm.
So do you have people, without getting into details,
Sure.
do you have people come to you who obviously are just going through a spiritual emergency or a spiritual crisis? How would you help somebody through that?
Do you mean going through a spiritual emergency or spiritual crisis as opposed to something else, or just?
Right. Because a spiritual crisis and a spiritual emergency, the criteria for that is quite different than, say, schizophrenia or bipolar or a psychotic episode, or but they are kind of the same.
Well, you see, there you go.
Yeah.
One would be called that. If somebody was having a spiritual crisis and went to kind of a systemic agency clinician, they would probably say they had schizophrenia or something
Right.
like that. So, what how I can best respond to that is to say that the way that I think I've been the most helpful to people is to relate to them in a way that doesn't feel demeaning.
Right.
Which so many of them, there's so much hurt, so much secondary trauma from the structural violence of the diagnoses that are so often, there's just someone in an office and they're basically just trying to do what they have to do. They're required to DSM them.
Right.
And they look through the book and they think, well, it's a little more like this one than that one. I'll just put down bipolar this, So many people I've worked with come in and say, so I'm a bipolar. And I say, well, actually, no, you're not. You're a person and we're here together. And maybe you've had some struggles that have expressed themselves in certain symptoms, and that's what somebody said about you. And maybe you have something like that, but maybe not. So my goal is to create a safe space for us to explore their experience without needing to check off a box that they have this or that.
Right.
I have a hard time separating spiritual experience from the psycho-spiritual. No one has ever come to me and identified it as a spiritual crisis or a spiritual emergency. They're suffering, they're in pain, or they have an old wound that is like a backpack that gets heavier and heavier and heavier, and they need somebody to help them compost their shit or unpack the backpack together so it gets lighter. And for me, that is a spiritual practice. We're not apart. We're walking together right next to them. And if we are really true to what we say we're doing, we have their back, and we're not going to leave them through the process. In that sense, we're like a guide. I actually don't really relate to counselor, because it sounds like you're counseling them and giving them advice. And psychotherapist, it still has connotations with psychoanalysis and Freud, which is, the furthest of my practice. So there's really no term that works, that's recognized. But, you have to work in the system that you live in to some extent.